long before the marble temples of Greece or the pyramids of Egypt. There was a land where the first words, the first laws, and the first cities rose from clay, and with them, the first rituals that blurred the line between devotion and degradation. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved veins through the desert, a strange custom ruled the lives of women. Every daughter, whether noble or beggar, was commanded to enter the great temple of Ishtar at least once in her life, not to pray, not to offer grain or incense, but to offer herself. Within the incense-choked chambers of the goddess of love and war, virgins sat waiting for strangers to approach, their bodies trembling under gold-painted walls and eyes carved in stone. When a man tossed a coin into her lap and whispered, "In the name of the goddess," the act became sacred. Not love, not desire, but duty. And once it was done, she was declared purified, forever marked by the divine touch of a stranger's hand. Ancient historians like Herodotus wrote of it with disbelief, yet cuneiform records confirm what seems unimaginable today, that the cradle of civilization was also a marketplace of the flesh, wrapped in sanctity. Here, sex was not sin. It was a form of taxation to the gods, an offering that blurred spirituality with submission. And this was only the beginning. Beneath those same temples lay darker practices: eunuch priests who bled themselves in ecstasy, child brides bound to idols, kings who married their daughters to preserve the blood of heaven. This was Mesopotamia, a world where holiness demanded humiliation, where the divine was carved from desire, and where civilization's first empire built its glory upon the most bizarre sexual customs the world had ever known. Before we descend deeper into the shadows of Babylon's forbidden rituals, take a moment to join the circle of those who dare to remember what history tried to erase. Subscribe to this channel if you crave the untold and the uncomfortable, the stories buried beneath marble and myth. Leave a comment below telling where in the world you're listening from, because across time and distance, curiosity binds us like an ancient thread, weaving the seekers of truth into one living memory. Now, return with me to Mesopotamia, where love was sacrifice, purity was payment, and faith demanded the body itself. In the beginning, there was promise. The rivers of Mesopotamia gave birth to the first gardens, the first cities, and the illusion that humankind could live in order rather than chaos. Between the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, kingdoms rose like mirages from dust: Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Babylon, all shimmering with ambition and pride. Their rulers called themselves shepherds of men, chosen by the gods to tame the wild and turn mud into law. It was here that writing was born, carved into wet clay with a reed stylus. Here that kings first claimed to speak with heaven, and here that the human body itself became a language of devotion. Every gesture, every breath, every private act was recorded and weighed before the gods, for Mesopotamia believed that creation itself was not complete until mankind surrendered its flesh to divine order. The goddess who reigned above them all was Ishtar Inanna to the Sumerians, the mistress of both love and war. She was beauty and terror embodied, a celestial paradox who demanded adoration in every form that the human body could give. Her temples towered like stairways to the heavens, their terraces lined with gold and lapis, their altars dripping with perfume and blood alike. The priests said that to serve Ishtar was to serve life itself, for she was the womb of creation, the morning star that rose from chaos. But in their fervor they forgot that the same goddess who blessed fertility also demanded submission, that her worship was not gentle prayer but surrender in its rawest, most intimate sense. Within her sanctuaries, flesh was sanctified, not by love but by ritual. The line between worship and exploitation dissolved until no one could tell where holiness ended and hunger began. When the kings of the early dynasties looked upon their people, they saw not citizens but offerings, living instruments through which divine balance was maintained. Some rulers were scholars, dreamers who studied the movements of stars, but others were consumed by the delusion that they themselves were divine, heirs to Ishtar's unearthly passion. One such figure, remembered only through fragments of clay tablets and mythic whispers, was Rim-Sin of Larsa, a king whose reign began with order and ended in delirium. He had inherited a city of poets and builders, a capital that gleamed beneath the desert sun, yet beneath its splendor rotted a quiet fear. The fear of divine displeasure. When drought came, when crops withered and mothers wept over empty cradles, the priests murmured that the goddess was angry, that desire itself had grown impure. The king, desperate to restore harmony, turned to the temples. He rebuilt them taller, richer, heavier with gold, and in doing so, he gave birth to something monstrous, a state where piety and pleasure fused into law. It was then that the sacred marriage ritual was revived, a yearly union between the king and a chosen priestess, meant to ensure fertility for the land. Before thousands of witnesses, the monarch would join with the living embodiment of Ishtar, while hymns rose like thunder from the ziggurat steps. The people cheered, believing their salvation was sealed in the rhythm of bodies and the scent of burning myrrh. Yet behind the spectacle lay the slow corruption of a civilization convinced that virtue could be purchased through flesh. The priesthood grew powerful, the common people obedient, and the boundaries between worship and coercion vanished. What began as devotion became debt. What began as reverence became ownership. By the time Rim-Sin's reign reached its zenith, every woman's body was a temple, every temple a marketplace, and every act of intimacy a coin tossed toward the heavens. The city glittered like paradise, but beneath its light, shadows began to stir, shadows that would soon consume Babylon's soul. As the centuries passed, and the kingdoms of Sumer and Akkad gave way to the grandeur of Babylon, the rituals that had once been whispered in sacred secrecy became instruments of control written into law. The great ziggurats that crowned the city were no longer merely temples but theaters of obedience, and within their towering walls the human body was reshaped into a symbol of divine submission. It was said that no woman could truly call herself pure until she had sat within the shadow of Ishtar's sanctuary and awaited the call of destiny, yet destiny arrived not as revelation but as humiliation. The temple courtyards were filled each evening with the scent of cedar smoke and myrrh, the low moan of flutes, and the murmured prayers of hundreds of women wrapped in thin linen robes, their faces painted with sacred ash. Some came willingly, others trembling, but all came because the law of the goddess left them no choice. A man would pass, toss a coin inscribed with the goddess's symbol into her lap, and whisper, "In the name of Ishtar." When the act was done, she would bathe in the Euphrates, weeping silently as the priests declared her cleansed. It was a ritual dressed in gold and incense, yet beneath its perfumed veil it was little more than state-sanctioned servitude. Ancient scribes recorded it without shame, calling it the rite of purity, as though sanctity could erase the sound of sobbing beneath temple arches. Over time, the boundaries of devotion stretched further. The priests of Ishtar, known as the Gala, were men who had renounced not only wealth but manhood itself. In their ecstatic devotion, they castrated themselves before the altar, offering their blood as proof of their loyalty to the goddess who blurred all boundaries between male and female. They dressed in silks, sang in falsetto, and wept in trance as drums beat like hearts around them. To the people they were holy, walking enigmas touched by the goddess's fire, yet behind their painted eyes lay a torment few dared to name. Their songs, preserved in fragments of clay tablets, speak of longing and despair, of bodies mutilated in search of divinity. "The goddess takes my strength," one hymn reads, "and fills me with her weeping." In the flicker of torchlight, the Gala swayed like reeds in the wind. Neither man nor woman, their identity dissolved into the voice of the goddess. It was said that to witness their ritual was to glimpse the face of divine madness, an ecstasy so complete that pain itself became sacred. In the deeper halls of the temple, far from the public eye, another ritual unfolded. Darker still, there were girls too young to understand what awaited them, daughters of peasants promised to the goddess as offerings in times of drought or plague. These brides of Ishtar were adorned in gold and perfumed oils, their small hands trembling as priests recited hymns older than memory. They were married not to men, but to statues, carved effigies of gods that loomed above them in silence. On the night of their union, a priest, acting as the vessel of divinity, consummated the marriage in a ceremony believed to bind the child to the goddess's spirit forever. To speak against it was heresy, and so generations of fathers offered their daughters in the name of salvation. Some died in childbirth before their 13th year. Others lived long enough to serve as priestesses themselves, repeating the same rituals that had once broken them. The clay tablets record their names only as numbers, objects of devotion, forgotten once their purpose was fulfilled. Inside the palaces, desire wore a different mask. Kings, claiming divine blood, convinced themselves that only through their own lineage could the gods' favor continue. Thus began the unions of blood, marriages between fathers and daughters, brothers and sisters, all justified by the myth that the gods themselves had been born of incest. The royal archives of Uruk speak of one monarch whose heir was both his son and his grandson, born of his own daughter. The chroniclers, careful not to anger the throne, describe the child as a being of double light, a euphemism for deformity so severe that the child could neither walk nor speak. Yet rather than see it as a curse, the priests declared it a miracle, a sign that the divine had mingled too deeply with mortal flesh. Such were the contradictions of a world where purity was measured not by compassion, but by bloodline. In the gleaming halls of Babylon, the children of these unions often bore the marks of their lineage: crooked spines, clouded eyes, twisted limbs, and yet they were paraded before the people as living proof of celestial descent. Behind the silks and jewels, their cries echoed through marble corridors, unseen by the world that worshipped their deformity. The cruelty did not end with the royals. Within the labyrinth of temple law, the punishment for breaking sacred vows was a theater of pain. The Code of Hammurabi, etched in black diorite, decreed that a woman accused of adultery should be bound and cast into the river to let the gods decide her innocence. If she drowned, it was justice. If she survived, it was mercy. Yet the same code that condemned her sanctified the prostitution of temple women, for the gods demanded their due. A man who forced himself upon a temple virgin was fined. A woman who refused the temple's call could be executed. The contradiction was divine by design, for control was the true currency of the gods. Each punishment became a spectacle. A drowning by moonlight, a public burning before the ziggurat meant to remind the people that the body was never their own. And yet, beneath the surface of official worship, there existed other sects, shadowed cults that twisted the rites of Ishtar into something far darker. In clay tablets uncovered near Nippur, archaeologists found hymns not to the goddess of love, but to her mirror, the dark twin some called Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Her followers believed that only through agony could the soul be freed from the cycle of death and rebirth. Their rituals combined pleasure and pain, offering blood as the highest form of devotion. In hidden chambers, worshippers drank wine mixed with narcotic herbs and lay together in ecstatic trance, believing that in the instant between pleasure and death, the veil between worlds could be pierced. Some died willingly, their faces frozen in rapture. Others were offered by force, bound in ritual silence as the torches flickered out. The priests of Ishtar called them heretics, but secretly envied their purity of belief. For these sects embraced the raw truth that their temple denied, that beneath every hymn to beauty lay the shadow of destruction. It was in this fevered atmosphere that Babylon reached its zenith, a city of 1,000 altars where law, lust, and worship merged into a single rhythm of control. The rulers who presided over it were not mere politicians but living idols, their every breath choreographed to mirror the gods they served. In the royal court, concubines were selected not for beauty but for omens, the pattern of moles on their skin, the way their shadow fell beneath the moonlight, the color of their tears during prayer. Some were kept in gilded cages to preserve their divine aura, forbidden to speak or see sunlight for years, until summoned for the king's nightly rites. The chronicles of Nebuchadnezzar's reign mention one such woman, a temple singer named Ninush, whose voice was said to calm storms. She was taken to the palace and declared the bride of the northern wind. Yet when she refused the king's advances, she was sealed alive in a bronze chamber filled with incense until her songs turned to screams. Her death was recorded as ascension. Such euphemisms became the poetry of cruelty, transforming suffering into sacred theater. But even in this city of ritualized power, there were those who saw the hypocrisy beneath the gold. The common people, taxed to fund temple feasts, whispered of rebellion. They had seen too many daughters vanish into the courtyards of the goddess, too many sons return from the river with the marks of punishment. Rumors spread that the gods had turned away, that the endless ceremonies had become hollow, that the rivers themselves were rejecting the blood poured into them. Yet fear held them silent, for to question the divine order was to invite annihilation. And so the rituals continued, each year more elaborate than the last, as though excess could silence guilt. Eventually, the obsession reached its breaking point. A great drought struck the land, the fields cracked, and the Euphrates shrank to a ribbon of mud. The priests proclaimed that Ishtar demanded a greater offering than ever before, a sacrifice of beauty itself. The decree was chilling. Every noble family must offer their eldest daughter to the temple for the great rite of renewal. In a single week, hundreds of young women were brought to the ziggurat, veiled and silent, as drums thundered across the city. The king, consumed by the belief that his dynasty's survival depended on appeasing the goddess, commanded that the ritual continue until the rains returned. What followed was a month of unbroken ceremony, where the cries of women mingled with the chants of priests, and the temple floors ran slick with wine, oil, and tears. When at last the first storm broke over the horizon, the city rejoiced, believing itself reborn. But those who had given their daughters did not celebrate. Their joy had turned to mourning, their faith to ash. The goddess had been fed, the empire saved, and yet something in the soul of Babylon had withered beyond repair. Thus the foundations of the most magnificent civilization on earth were soaked not only with river water, but with the silent despair of its own people. The rituals continued for centuries, codified and refined, spreading across empires and ages. From Sumer to Akkad, from Assyria to Babylon, the creed remained the same. The gods owned the body, and pleasure was the price of order. And through it all, the temples of Ishtar gleamed beneath the sun like golden prisons, monuments to humanity's oldest delusion, that submission could bring salvation. In the final years of that age, the illusion that had sustained Babylon began to crack, though none dared to admit it aloud. The great rite had brought rain, but it also brought madness, a fever that spread not through the body, but through the conscience of a people who had long forgotten how to tell devotion from desecration. The king, now old and frail, wandered the marble corridors of his palace with incense clinging to his robes and visions clouding his mind. He believed he could hear Ishtar's voice whispering to him from the shadows, urging him to make one last offering, greater than any before. Night after night he dreamed of rivers turning to gold, of temples gleaming in eternal light, and of his name being carved beside the stars. His priests, terrified and obedient, took these dreams as divine command, and so began the final ceremony that would end both his reign and his empire. A decree was sent through the land. Every maiden of noble birth was to spend one night within the temple, to become for a single evening the bride of the goddess. Those who refused would be branded heretics, their families stripped of land and title. The order was madness, yet no one could oppose it, for to speak against the king was to defy the gods themselves. As the nights of the great offering began, the city transformed into a living tomb of perfume and prayer. Thousands of torches burned across the ziggurat terraces, casting the faces of the waiting girls in a trembling amber glow. From the palace balconies, the nobles watched as their daughters were led away in silence, their veils fluttering like moth wings in the wind. The air was thick with chanting, drums echoing against the riverbanks, and the faint metallic scent of oil and sweat. Inside the temple, the priests moved like phantoms, their hands trembling as they prepared the altars with rose petals and sacrificial wine. The first girls entered at dusk and did not return by dawn. When their mothers begged for answers, the priests told them the goddess had taken them into her eternal embrace. At first, people believed it, but as the days turned to weeks and the temple gates remained closed, unease began to spread through the city like smoke seeping through stone. There were whispers of cries in the night, of blood staining the temple floors, of fires seen flickering behind sealed doors. The turning point came when the queen herself vanished. She had been the last thread of sanity binding the royal court together, a woman once known for her intelligence and quiet defiance. Some said she had fled the city disguised as a servant. Others claimed she was taken by the priests to serve as the final offering. The truth, as later chroniclers hinted, was far darker. On the eve of the king's final ritual, the queen entered the temple willingly, veiled in white, carrying in her hands a golden bowl filled with myrrh and human ash. Before the gathered priests, she declared that she would offer herself to the goddess in her husband's name, and before anyone could stop her, she drank the contents of the bowl. She collapsed at the foot of Ishtar's statue, her last breath escaping in a whisper that no one could understand. Some said she cursed the city. others that she freed it. But from that night forward, nothing in Babylon was the same. The king, upon hearing of her death, tore his robes and ordered the temple sealed. He did not eat or speak for 7 days. On the 8th, he was found dead beside the queen's empty throne, his hand clutching the carved likeness of the goddess he had worshipped all his life. What followed was chaos. The people, no longer fearing divine wrath, stormed the temples in fury. They smashed the idols, tore down the altars, and dragged the priests through the streets. Flames rose from the ziggurats, their golden tiles melting into rivers of molten glass. The sacred chants that had once echoed through the city were drowned out by screams and the roar of fire. The great river turned black with ash as the smoke of Babylon's sins spiraled into the heavens. When the dawn finally came, it revealed a city of ruins, a paradise reduced to cinders by its own devotion. The few survivors wandered among the ashes, clutching fragments of idols, as if still unable to believe that the gods they had served so faithfully were nothing more than reflections of their own hunger for control. And yet, even as the city burned, the priests who escaped carried their doctrines to new lands. They fled east to Assyria, west to Canaan, south to the shores of the Gulf, whispering that the goddess demanded rebirth. In their exile, the rites of Babylon were reborn in new forms, stripped of their grandeur but still breathing through secret cults, whispered hymns, and blood-soaked offerings. The names changed. Ishtar became Astarte, Inanna became Aphrodite, but the hunger remained the same. Civilizations rose and fell, each believing itself purer, wiser, more civilized than the last, and yet each one returned to the same altar of domination, cloaked in the same perfume of sanctity. Babylon fell, but her spirit did not die, it simply learned to hide. When centuries later travelers stood among the ruins of that once mighty city, they found only silence. The temples had crumbled, the rivers had shifted their course, and the wind whispered through hollow bricks inscribed with hymns to forgotten gods. Among those ruins, an archaeologist once uncovered a clay tablet bearing a single line written in the old tongue. The smoke of our worship rose higher than our prayers. Perhaps it was written by a scribe who survived the fall, or perhaps by one who saw it coming. Either way, it remains the truest epitaph for the empire that mistook desire for divinity and perished in the embrace of its own creation. Centuries have passed since Babylon's towers fell and its ziggurats sank into dust. Yet the echo of its obsession still lingers in the bones of civilization. The tablets and idols unearthed from that ancient soil tell a truth far deeper than myth, that humanity's pursuit of holiness has always been entangled with its hunger for control. The most bizarre sexual customs of ancient Mesopotamia were not merely the excesses of a forgotten people. They were reflections of a universal flaw, the belief that suffering can sanctify, that domination can purify, that the body is a gateway through which the soul can be bought or sold. Beneath every marble temple and golden scripture that followed, traces of Babylon's logic endured. Its rituals transformed into dogmas, its offerings renamed as vows, its priests reborn in every age that sought to command desire rather than understand it. The empire that called itself the cradle of civilization was, in truth, humanity's first mirror, showing us what we are capable of when faith becomes possession and love becomes law. Its ruins remind us that every empire begins by worshipping its gods and ends when it realizes the gods it served were only reflections of itself, burning in the dark.